Nobody in the media is explaining how Donald Trump can win the New York hush money case. In fact, it seems that the liberal media has been saying that it's impossible for Trump to win. They say it's impossible because Trump is so obviously guilty. And the conservative media, likewise, has been saying that it's impossible to win. They say it's impossible because Trump can't get a fair jury in New York. I'm going to explain step by step how Donald Trump can definitely win this case. My name is Joseph Hudak. I'm a criminal defense lawyer headquartered in Pennsylvania, but I do cases in every state, typically along with local counsel, and hopefully I can give you expert guidance for understanding the Trump trial. And at the end of each video, I'll give you Trump's scorecard on each issue that we discuss. Now, at the start of every trial, everybody's focused on the jury selection. No doubt, this is critically important, and I will explain in detail how that process works. But before lawyers even begin thinking about jury selection, we've got to figure out the case, both sides of it. We have to figure out exactly what the prosecution needs to prove, and then what type of jurors would be receptive to that and what type of jurors would be unreceptive to that. Once we have that figured out, and at the very end of this video, I'll give you Trump's scorecard on that. Once we have that figured out, then we have to figure out the defense side of the case. And then we do the same thing. We try to figure out what type of jurors would be receptive to the defense and what type of jurors would be unreceptive to that type of a defense. Now notice, I did not say at all that we have to get rid of progressives or other people who want Trump to lose the election, or people who think Trump will end democracy as we know it, people who think Trump is racist, xenophobic, jingoistic, chauvinistic, or people who hate Trump in general. This goes without saying, these people can't be on the jury. If you're rooting for Trump, don't worry. Most, if not all of these people, in fact, will not be on the jury. The process works much better than you think. It's ultimately unlikely that these people would be able to survive the jury selection interview. In the Trump trial, every juror had to fill out a questionnaire under oath with 42 questions. These 42 questions tell a lot about a person. And then the lawyers, both sides, get to ask follow-up questions. So the lawyers have a good opportunity to bring out any favoritism or preconceptions or agendas that political jurors might have. But think about it like this. If a person with an agenda for or against Trump wanted to con their way onto that jury, either to hurt or to help Trump, it would be extremely difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's extremely unlikely that someone could do that. And that's not even to mention that the lawyers are looking into the backgrounds of these people, everything about them, their social media. A person who could con their way onto the Trump jury would have to be capable of almost CIA-level espionage. So these people won't be on the Trump jury. But we've got to go much beyond that. If we're trying to win the case for Trump, we want the jury to understand the prosecution's side of the case, because it's going to be extremely hard for the prosecution in this case to prove what it's required to prove. The prosecution has to make a 2-cushion shot, 9-ball in the side pocket. It's hard to do that, and the prosecution has to prove each part of it beyond a reasonable doubt. So I would want the most intelligent jurors I could get. And it sounds like the Trump jury might be like that. 2 men from the financial sector in Manhattan. I wouldn't worry about the bias they might have if they think Trump is a sleazy businessman. I don't think that'll matter. In order to be in their business, they have to be intelligent and highly analytical, and that's exactly what's needed in this case. There's also 2 lawyers on this jury. Most lawyers will never let another lawyer on their jury, but I myself do, if I'm confident that my legal analysis of the case is correct. It's interesting, in this case, apparently both sides are confident that their legal analysis is correct. I don't have any of the evidence that each side is going to present, so I don't know. But just in general, I think the prosecution's two-cushion shot is hard to prove. At the end of the video, I'll give you Trump's scorecard in numbers versus the prosecution. So let's talk about what the prosecution has to prove. Now, it's important preliminarily what the prosecution's case is not about. It's not about whether Trump did or didn't have sex with Stormy Daniels. Even if it did happen, it might be in bad taste, it might be immoral, but it's not a crime. It's also not about whether Trump paid hush money. That's perfectly legal, and it's done many times every day in corporate America. A sexual harassment claim is filed. The company, sometimes the individual, pays money to settle the case, and then the alleged victim withdraws the claim and signs a non-disclosure agreement. It's done every day in America. Nothing illegal about it. An interesting side thought about this, if any of you remember the 9th presidential primary debate in 2020, that year only the Democrats had primary debates. Elizabeth Warren just assassinated billionaire Michael Bloomberg right on stage. She asked him to sign a waiver of all his non-disclosure agreements. It was a devastating blow to him and his campaign, but the point is, he was not charged with a crime for that. It's not against the law. A good question to ask might be whether the Manhattan District Attorney has looked into whether Michael Bloomberg reported it and how he reported it. Maybe he put it down as legal fees. We'll get there in regard to how Trump put it down as legal fees. But first, in Trump's case, it's a little more complicated. This was a so-called catch and kill. Now, in the tabloid newspaper business, a paper like the National Enquirer will buy a scandalous story and then kill the story for a celebrity who doesn't want to be embarrassed. The celebrity pays the person involved in the scandal. The person signs a non-disclosure agreement, and everybody's happy. It might be sleazy and disgusting, but it's common in some circles, and it's not against the law. Now, just as a side issue for now, we'll talk about this more in part 2 when we discuss Trump's defenses. The National Enquirer catch and kill operation seems more devious than the Michael Bloomberg non-disclosure agreements. But bear in mind, that's not exactly Trump's fault. Stormy Daniels exploited, if not extorted, Trump. All Trump did was allegedly go to the bedroom with her and do whatever he did. Why should Trump even have to pay money to her in the first place? Why did she put him in the position that it was necessary for him to do a catch and kill in the first place? In any event, whether he did or didn't has nothing to do with the case. What the case is really about is a little more complicated. This is where the prosecution has to make the two-cushion shot. Now, there's time limits on a prosecution. The only way that this case can be prosecuted at this time is if the prosecution can prove, 1, that Trump made a false bookkeeping entry, and 2, the false bookkeeping entry was made to cover up some other crime. For example, I falsified the books. Why? Because I embezzled some money and I wanted to cover it up. So what must the prosecution prove in this case? Number 1, Trump made a false bookkeeping entry. Let's assume that they can prove that. It's debatable, but for now, let's assume they can prove that. Of the $130,000 that was paid, only $30,000 actually went to the lawyer, Michael Cohen. $100,000 went to Stormy Daniels and her lawyer. Then Trump just put it down as a $130,000 legal fees payment to Michael Cohen. I've actually seen lawyers charge a client like that. a set fee to cover a project, a settlement, whatever, a flat fee. And the lawyer covers all the expenses. But let's assume for bookkeeping purposes this was false or even fraudulent to characterize the whole $130,000 as legal fees. That crime cannot be prosecuted. This allegedly happened in 2016. For the prosecution of that misdemeanor false bookkeeping entry, the statute of limitations is 2 years. In order to prosecute this today, the prosecution must prove, number 2, that this was done to cover up some other crime, an embezzlement, bribing a public official. But in this case, there's a payoff, almost an extortion threat, and that's not a crime. You're allowed to pay hush money. So the question is, was it a campaign expense? Campaign expenses have to be reported to the Federal Election Commission. And it's quite common, actually, for there to be errors on these reports. So, was Donald Trump, in fact, required to report this hush money, this catch and kill payment, as a campaign expense? It's not a television commercial. It's not a vote for Trump billboard. It's not clear if it even was for the campaign. Trump might have paid it to keep Mrs. Trump from knowing about Stormy Daniels. Now, I'm not a campaign finance lawyer, but what I'm told again and again is the example of a person who wears $500 suits and he decides to run for Congress, and so he buys a $3,000 suit. The suit is not a campaign expense. So I would argue that if there was any other reason that Trump paid the hush money, so his wife wouldn't find out, so his family and business associates wouldn't find out, if the very vain and arrogant Donald Trump personally felt embarrassed for even being with a porn star, if he thought they would make a porn parody about him, then it probably would not be a campaign expense. And if it was not a campaign expense, then it would not be a crime for him not to report it. And then, if that was not a crime, then there was no crime for him to cover up, and he would not be guilty in this case. Now, for Trump to win, the jurors have to understand all of this. I understand why the prosecution wants a smart jury. They can't even begin to prove their case. Everything I just explained without a pretty smart jury. But I think ultimately this goes in Trump's favor, because if the jury does in fact understand all of this, it's going to be extremely hard for the prosecution to eliminate all reasonable doubt about each part of that two-cushion shot, 9-ball in the side pocket. Now, assuming that the jury that has been selected is smart, and they do appear to be smart, I'd say that at this point, Trump is up 3-2. Please click like in the bottom of your screen. In the next video, part 2, we'll explain what type of jurors would be most receptive to Trump's defenses.